It's quite an honor to be back here, quite honestly. And the intent, as Pastor Bud said, is to let you appreciate what our country is investing, what this means for a very complicated part of the world, and to help you understand from a historical, geographical, economic, cultural, religious, and military perspective what's going on here. But before I get into that, it's a real honor, quite honestly, to stand before you. I've got the class of, one could say, one of the better classes in Rittman High School. I don't know if it's famous or infamous, one of the two, but we sure had a good time. And the ladies, I think, are not aging. It's just the men, right, Roland, in terms of what's going on here. But thanks for coming. And previous teachers, family and friends from way back. So when I come back here and stand in the church and think about Rittman, it's nothing but great memories. Because as I tell everybody, when they talk about the wonderfulness of our country, I use Rittman as an example. It's about the right size, because I was not as many people so I could play sports. And the importance of sports as we're going through school. The teachers that we were with all through school. And the friends, because we went to not too many schools or opportunities anymore to graduate from high school with buddies and that you went to from kindergarten all the way through. And not only that, the foothold and the roots for our great country in terms of what family, friends, and community contributions all mean to what we stand for. So I thank you all for that, because you've been part of that, quite honestly. And thanks to Mom and Dad. It's always great to come back and see them. And my mom's two sisters, Aunt Ruth and Aunt Nixie, are here. I worked on Aunt Ruth's farm for several years, which is another, get your roots in real deep when you think about Holstein cows and shoving silage and all that kind of stuff. And Aunt Nixie over the years have always been a wonderful part of the family as we shared at Christmas times. And it's nice to have family and friends to come back and visit with that. It's always so fond. And with us back, the audio video help is our newest addition outside the family, which is Losi, our son-in-law, Jenny's husband. They had the world's most perfect wedding on the 30th of July. And so I put him to work right away to run the video help for us today. And his eyes are better than mine, so he'll be able to flip the charts for us. And thank you. And so without further ado, let's look at Iraq. We're going to talk a little bit in the beginning about the historic perspective. And you'll say, well, who's this Allenbaugh guy? And I am no expert on Iraq. And quite honestly, I'm not too sure there are as many as we think there are out there. Because part of our educational system that we probably should concentrate a bit more on is cultural awareness. Because each country that we become involved with have their own historical roots and their own history, many times longer than our own. And this is a place in Iraq when you go back in time a little bit and think about what it means to our history. And I spoke at our church, as Pastor Bud said, and I confused all the folks back there because they never, who is this guy and what are you doing in Iraq again? I thought you were out of the Army. Well, I retired from the Army, as you know, in 1997. I worked as a contractor for about 7 years, still affiliated with the military, but on the civilian side. Then a year ago, April, came back with the government. So my good friend of mine was a senior intelligence officer in the United States Army. We worked together at Fort Bragg and said, hey, I need you back over in Iraq. So that's the kind of friends to have once you go back over to Iraq. So I went over there as the deputy, number 2 man, to the senior intelligence officer for the multinational forces Iraq. So when you look at the organization, it's a bit confusing. And we'll go back to the historical perspective, but as we speak, there's a multinational force. You see General Casey on television all the time, the 4-star general, who works for General Abize, who's down at Central Command out of Tampa, Florida. And then underneath him is a corps. The corps is about 200,000 people. 18th Airborne Corps is just now leaving. That was Lieutenant General Vines out of Fort Bragg. And it was nice going back there because I'd worked with all these individuals before over time, so it was kind of old homework, which was professionally rewarding to me as we work through some of the challenges. And as we speak, they're changing out. A corps from Europe is coming in, and 18th Airborne Corps goes home the 21st of this month after being gone for a year. So there's many families, as Pastor Bud said, making sacrifices from the military side, National Guard, United States Army Reserve, Department of the Army civilians, other civilians, contractors, and volunteers. And in our church back in Southern Pines, I know there's 5 families right now that have relatives, either husbands, sons, daughters, or whatever, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, which is the same challenge, quite honestly, as we're faced in Iraq. So as we think about this is us. I mean, this is what we're trying to do to make the world better. And when you think about it, I do believe that every human being is about the same. And if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you go to the left part of the scale, it's being able to take care of yourself, your family, your close surroundings, have a secure environment, and have some type of vision or participation in the future. And that's really what most people want. And when you think about it, our way of life epitomizes that. And other forms of government, there's individuals that get to the top that minimize that because they're all about themselves. And so when you look at Noriega and Panama, which when I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, we worked with that. And we look at Saddam Hussein, and that it kind of comes as part of what we're dealing with. And the other part of is when you think about our country and our way of life, democracies tend to not to fight democracies. Why? Let's go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If everybody has their eyes open, understand what's going around them, it's more difficult to suppress them. And so you'll find these dictators, these ones that are very harsh leaders, do everything they can to suppress, if you will, the understanding of life about them. And Saddam Hussein was a master of all that. And we'll see why he was able to manipulate the people as he did. So what I'd like to do is orient us on Iraq. One would say, well, everybody knows where Iraq is. But when you look at it, it's kind of a fascinating place in the world and in history. It's access to the ocean. The Persian Gulf is about 58 kilometers right there. There's Kuwait. Remember Kuwait back in 1990? Saddam Hussein said that was always part of Iraq, so what's the big deal? There was thought there was going to be a kind of a agreement by the United States going to Kuwait, nobody cares, everything will be wonderful, and he'll give him more access to the Persian Gulf. And we come around this way with Saudi Arabia. And you know the historic significance of Saudi Arabia, and we're going to talk about that more from Mecca and Medina with the Islam faith, and still the journeys that go back to those cities in the Saudi Arabia. Coming up along the border then is Jordan right here. Go up this way is Jerusalem. Palestinian-Jerusalem issue is all part of this when you think about the two cultures and how they meet. Syria, we still have a lot of challenges with Syria in terms of their view of the world, their understanding of how they want things to go, and our, quite honestly, conflict with some of their outlooks on life. Turkey has been an interesting coalition partner. As you remember when we did Desert Shield and Desert Storm, we tried to position Army forces in Turkey and come down through, and they turned that down at the last moment. But once again, it's all about give and take. It's a little bit of manipulation, a little bit of diplomacy, a little bit of what's in it for me. We've had forces stationed in Turkey over time doing significant work. And then you work the Iranian border. Huge influence from the Islam, Muslim faith, part of the Iraqi cultural influence from Iran. We're going to talk about the Shias and the Sunnis and the Kurds a little bit more, but you read about in the paper all the time the dilemma right now on do they or do they not have nuclear weapons. And then also the significance of Iran from the religious perspective. Right on the other side of Iran is Afghanistan. So when you look at Iran, you wonder why they're uptight. We've got the United States on this side, the United States sitting on this side. And so from the historical perspective, they say, are we going to be like the British and not leave? Or what's going on here? So that's all part of this backdrop in terms of the setting of Iraq. Then you look at it from a economic and from its actual strengths, from its resources. The two big things are the Tigris River that goes from Turkey down into the Persian Gulf, and then the Tigris River that comes from the west down through Baghdad into the Persian Gulf. In the olden days, they said about 3% of the world's potable water existed there. Remember back in Moses' time and that, the two rivers are very significant, still are, because that makes it a transnational part of this part of the world, and still a good part of their actual, can't see that, an actual part of their importance of their economic trade, of the transportation of goods across there. The road networks or all the lines you see up there, not what you think of the United States in terms of four-lane roads. Some of them are dirt, not well maintained, but once again, a transnational movement of goods north to south, east, and west made it very historically important. About twice the size of Idaho. And when you think in terms of the economic significance of it, thanks. High-tech stuff. Now I'll push the wrong button, it'll go backwards, right?
Yeah, don't hit the green one.
Don't hit the green one. All right. Oh, okay. From its natural resources, agriculture is its main input. About 13% of their output is from agriculture. Oil, as you can anticipate, is number one. We'll talk about the significance of that later on from the parts of the people that live in Iraq and also from the world's outlook. But there's also other natural resources, phosphate, sulfur, and from the agriculture standpoint, some cattle, some sheep, a little bit of wheat, and but mainly it comes back to oil, which is their cash crop. When we think then in terms of other parts of this is the people. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But let's go back in time a little bit from the historical perspective. This is all part of the Ottoman Empire back in what we would call when the world was divided up amongst conquerors. But you can go back even further than that into the time of Abraham in the book of Genesis. And Abraham's a significant guy. We'll talk about him later on, his descendants. When you think about he being the father of the three major religions, that being Christianity, Judaism, and the Muslim faith, and how his offspring is part of the whole dilemma we face. But if you think about the people, average lifespan right now is 68. Women live to be about 67. Males about 69. Women have about 4.5 babies as an average. Kind of hard to have half a baby, but that's how the averages work out. But lots of kids, because once again, it's kind of like where we were in previous times. Lots of offspring to help run the family business. The heritage of an Iraqi is very important. The senior male is supposed to go back about 7 generations in time and being able to understand who they're from and all of that relationship, and even how they name themselves, the son of. I would be the son of George. Bin, B-I-N, son of, is how that works. Of course, that's very complicated in our way of thinking because they spell differently than we do, and believe it or not, they lie to us in terms of when we talk to them and when we capture them, because they'll change their names as they go along. And we can't spell their names phonetically very well. So there's a lot of programs and information technology we run through just to get the right spelling of their names, because as they go back in time, they'll pick out a sheik or some relative who did a good thing and attach his name onto theirs. So there's no naming construct that they'll follow. So there's a lot of variations in how that works. So the transliterations of languages of their Arabic language, which is difficult enough, makes it more challenging. But we're going to talk about the people a bit more on when we go further into this. Education-wise, only about 40% of the people are educated, and the males about 56% and the females 24%, which is intentional to keep the women uneducated, which is not necessarily what the Quran says, which we'll talk about that in more detail too, how they manipulate their own biblical scripture in terms of how that's to work. But let's go back in time quickly, though. We talked about the Ottoman Empire, and really back to Abraham's time. We're going to talk about Muhammad a little bit later on. He comes into being around 5070 AD. But back before that, and even before Christ's time, this is an important part of the world. And historically speaking, Babylon was about right there on the Tigris River. On the Euphrates River that comes in from the west. And I said Baghdad, which is the center of the cultural, economic, political, everything. It's kind of like Seoul in Korea. Everything revolves around Baghdad. And on the east side, you've got the Tigris River, and on the west side, you have the Euphrates. So right here on the Euphrates was Babylon. Everybody's heard about that over time. So culturally speaking, they were much more powerful people, country, institution than the United States ever was when you look back in time. There's centuries back in the olden days where this was really the center of civilization. One when you think in terms of major inventions that occurred there, the wheel, the legal system that was basically as a foundation began there. The 12-month calendar was really initiated there. And so when you go back before the 1200s, it was a significant part of our civilization in terms of what we learned from them. As you mentioned, the growth of Islam occurred between 570 when Muhammad was born, and then when he died in 632, and then the importance of the faith as we know it now. But we're going to get into that in just a moment. But then if you go into 1258, things kind of started going downhill for Iraq. The Mongols came in from Asia and literally destroyed what we would consider civilization at that time. Took all the writings, the books, threw them into the Tigris River, took all the intellects back to Asia, because a lot of the medical discoveries were occurring about that time were all taken back. So Iraq was really devastated, stripped down to the bare human status at that point in time. And from that point forward, the Iraqi people never really trusted anybody. You can kind of see why, because that carries on in terms of their verbal expression of their history and their culture as they go forward. So Saddam Hussein manipulated that too. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. So at 1258, from then on, as I said, it kind of went downhill for the Iraqis. World War II then came, and Great Britain occupied Iraq as we know it today. And after the war, there was some debate going on who should get what. Part of the things that the winner takes all in these major conflicts, as you know, and what we do is we tend to forget about the cultural boundaries and just divide things up by what would tend to make sense, either along the rivers or along whatever people think makes sense. Sometimes it's economic. So France and, UK, United Kingdom were fighting over Syria. Who should get that? Not physically fighting, but debating. And Great Britain ended up with the majority of Iraq. And they ran the country and up until about 1920. In 1920, there was a major revolt. In fact, there's still a lot of British influence down here in Basra. If you look at the cities, Basra on the coast, Baghdad in the center, Mosul up here, Kirkuk, you hear a lot about, and we'll talk about the significance of those. But back in historic times, those were significant cities, as they still are. So then in about 1958, the Iraqis had what they would call a revolution or a freedom, if you will, from the British. And that's when a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein became to come into power, because he at that time was in the military and really controlled the military strength and power of where they went in time. That's how he manipulated everything. If you look at the next slide then, Losi. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, because this begins to talk about some of the divisions of Iraq and what's going on. The majority of the people are considered Arab, but we even confuse that term. Back in biblical times, Arabs referred to really descendants of the Arab world, which is really this part of the world in North Africa down through here. Now we tend to confuse it, whether from Saudi Arabia or whatever, but it's really from a cultural perspective, all of this part of the world, and to include part of North Africa, are considered Arab. So if you look at the Arab population, it's about 85 to 90% of the people. And then you divide the Arabs up into parts, then it depends, it goes into their language or their cultural and religious breakdowns. The way this works, the majority of the one part of the religious part of Islam are the Shia, S-H-I-I-T-E, or that's a Shiite, and the Shia, C-H-I-I-A. And up here in this red part are the Sunnis, S-U-N-N-I. And up in the northeast are the Kurdish. If you go back in time, how did they have this separation in such fundamental beliefs and how that worked? So this really goes back now to Abraham. And really what you see in some of the Palestinian Jewish debate going on there right now. They all trace their lineage back to Abraham. And as you know, Abraham met Isaac through Sarah and Ishmael through Hagar. Well, many believe that the Christian Jewish lineage pretty much goes back through Isaac, and the Muslim faith that tends to come back through Hagar and Ishmael. But one could argue, what's the big debate? Because the Abraham said, and so did Muhammad say, there shouldn't be fighting amongst their own people. So one could begin to debate the divisive nature we see of these religions as time goes on. But it's pretty logical when you begin to see how this unfolds. From the Iranian influence, you heard me say that's the Shia. Well, they're the minority of the Muslim faith. The Sunni are the most abundant. But in Iraq, it's just reversed. So the Shia, because of its physical proximity to Iran, makes them the majority. The Sunni, if you look at the overall population of the Muslim faith, are the majority, but the minority here. Well, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. So he used that to his manipulation. So why the divisive nature between the Sunnis and the Shia? Well, they all believe that Muhammad, as I mentioned, was born in 570 A.D. in Mecca, was the last true prophet of God. And he recognized Jesus and other prophets, but not really as the prophet, the one who really heard, as they believe, written down on golden tablets in heaven, the directions they received that he wrote, scribed down, which became the Quran. As I mentioned, that was between about 610 and 632. But now the Quran lived on. It's after that to about 650, there was continual descriptions and writings about all that. But the Quran is broken down about 144 shuriyah, like what we would call chapters. But if you haven't looked at the Quran, we tend to get spoiled because it's already been, I'll call, westernized. There's a nice layout. It looks logical. There's chapters, sentences, verses, and all that. But that's not how it was written. It was written with no enunciation, no periods, or just writing. And all obviously direct directions to mankind from Allah or God. So at that time, the Bedouins, all these tribes, were all disparate. And Muhammad wanted to bring them all back together, so he was the prophet that wrote this and began to teach it. And part of the theory then was jihad. You hear about that term being misused all the time, the holy war, dying for the jihad. Well, jihad means suffering. And so the 5 pillars, if you will, that Muhammad inscribed as part of Islam were, number 1 was really as we would call missionary work or testimony, talking about the goodness of Allah or God. The second of the 5 pillars is prayer. As you well know, it's a very significant part of the Islam faith, which, oh, by the way, to the Muslims, Islam is not just a religion, it's a way of life. Their whole purpose in life is to try and please God. And oh, by the way, in their way of looking at God, He's not your buddy. He doesn't have a son, doesn't have a Holy Spirit. There's only one individual, almighty, all-seeing, who's very dominating in terms of His control of the world. And your whole purpose in life is to try and please Him. So as you see, as they think about everything, and the rigors and the discipline of prayer is very significant to them. So as you know, 5 times a day, it varies by where they are in the 12-month calendar, where the positioning is of the sun, because their time changes when they do their prayers. They're out very religiously praying, facing toward Mecca. So if you go in a mosque, you don't see like the cross or any symbology, because that would be considered an idol. You'll just see an arrow toward Mecca, and that's where they'll bow down to pray. So testimony, prayer, and then the other part is actually almsgiving, or giving money toward others. And so part of what you see as a dilemma going on right now is the fighting amongst the various leaderships is to be part of this religious requirement to donate to the poor and really pay toward the church leadership. And the other part is fasting in the month of September during Ramadan. They donate from daybreak to sunset for the entire month, which is once again to cleanse your soul and your body and get closer to God. And the other part is pilgrimage back to Mecca. And sometime during your life, you're instructed to go back to Mecca. And then you can even see that in their attire. Those that are in white have not yet been to Mecca. Those that have the headgear with black and white squares, they belong to a country that has a monarch, like Saudi Arabia, but they've been to Mecca. Those that you see that are red and white live in a country where there's an elected official like Syria, Jordan, that sort of thing, but they've been to Mecca. So you can see the importance of this journey back to Mecca, the birthplace of Muhammad. And the Muslim faith, if you read through it, it doesn't say what you're seeing going on in the world. There's nothing about killing in there. There's nothing about abuse of women. There's nothing about what's going on. But they do believe that it is the only faith. They do believe as part of the testimony that occurs, their job is to influence the rest of the world. As you know, the Muslim faith right now is about 1.3 billion, the fastest growing religion in the world. The last 50 years, it's expanded 500%. The Christian faith, about 47%. And the majority of the followers of Islam are not Muslim, which is also interesting. When you look at the old Soviet Union, Russia, if you look at Indonesia, large populations of followers of the Islam faith, but not Muslim. Around this part of the world, 97% of the people are in fact of Muslim faith. In the United States alone, we've gone from about 400, not quite, mosques in the United States, up to about 1,400 in the last 30 years. So it's one of the most rapid growing religions in our own country, as a lot of young people are influenced by the very logical, as they see, description and the aggressive approach of the Muslim faith. So if it's all that good, why the debate between the Sunni and the Shia? Well, part of the beliefs was that the next Muhammad, when he died in 632, part of the followers were very insistent that the next Muhammad, descendant prophet, had to be a direct descendant of the Muhammad who just died. And he had about, I think, 9 wives, and his favorite wife, red hair, was beside him when he died. Multiple wives were not an issue, but they were, even in today in Iraq, the average dowry is about 64,000. I'd have 128,000, the more I think about it. Well, so you got a pretty good deal there. But nonetheless, his favorite wife was beside him when he died, and they had no descendants. So that created a problem. So his first cousin was named Ali, A-L-I, and he had 2 sons. One was Hussein, and one was Hassan. Hassan tended to lean toward what we know now as the Sunnis, and the Hussein's lineage tended to go toward the Shia. Well, the interesting part then was this was not much of a problem until after Muhammad died, and then there was a big battle that occurred. He went back. He was run out of Mecca in 622 and came back, and there was a lot of killing that went on. And then after that, you saw the real divisiveness between the Shia and the Sunni. And this has continued over time because it's a major separation in how they look at things. The Sunni believe that you should take the translations of the Quran literally. Basically, you just have a smart individual as your leader. So it's almost like the Catholic way of doing things. Elect, if you will, like the Pope, the leader, and they have the right to describe to you what the Quran says. The Shia, on the other hand, have what they call imams, I-M-M-A-Ms. And they are absolutely empowered by God to tell the people what's going on. So it's not just a translation, but it's really their interpretation, because they're of that stature in life, to interpret what the Quran says. So you can see right then a significant separation of how they look at the things, how they look at their religion. The Sunnis had the Salafans, was their leadership. They no longer exist, but the Imams are still around. And they'll issue things called fatwas, which are actually edicts. You will do this type directions to the Shia. Now there's a 12th Imam still exists living in Saudi Arabia, so that lineage goes on. So that begins to see all that breakdown. So think in terms of 85% of the Shia and the Sunnis, and this is called the Sunni Triangle, which now, remember, during Saddam Hussein were the good guys. Now they were run out during the Iraq-Iran war, and now they're no longer in power, and some of them just don't get it yet. And the Shia before were the majority, but also the suppressed and not a part of the government. So you've got the Shia who now are the majority in charge, were not really experienced and also suppressed and didn't trust anybody from their time under Saddam Hussein, who was there for 38 years. And the Sunnis, who were the intellects, and the ones around the country who the country needs now, but are causing all kinds of havoc with outside help. What's going on. Now up in the, so think in terms of about 80 to 85% of the countryside and the population being Sunni, being Shia, and about 30% being Sunni, and up in this corner, about 5 million, 18.5 million total. Up in this corner is about 5 million Kurds. They come from the Iranian descent. They're doing pretty well. See this green line right here? That's enforced by the United States and Overfly, and really they've got their own army called the Peshmerga. They've got water, which, oh, by the way, will become more important than oil over time. They've got access to oil fields, and they said, by the way, you give me Kirkuk, which I pretty much have now, you give me part of Mosul, you give me Tikrit, I'll really be happy. Because now I've got a good part of the oil fields up here. Down in this corner with the Shia, they've got a good part of the oil fields as we speak. And they also have their own support by their own militia. You heard the name Muqtada al-Sadr, who really led the fight in Fallujah up here, and we literally had to level Fallujah because of the fierce fighting. He said, run all the Americans out, kill everybody. That's why we're going to do this. And now he's an elected official, and some of his lieutenants help run the new part of the government. So you can see that over time, because after the Kuwaiti War, we went after Desert Shield, Desert Storm. We did a no-fly zone, and we had the dollars for oil, so that people would not be ravaged and take care of themselves medically, and their families would be okay. Well, I'll show you pictures, and you'll see what Saddam Hussein did with that money. The Kurds didn't have anything under Saddam Hussein. He killed a great number of them by the chemical fights. They're pretty happy right now. Oh, by the way, the president during the coalition provisional government was an Iraqi. I'm sorry, it was a Kurdish leader, so they were very happy when that occurred. And so from 2003, when we went back in after 2000, the 9/11 incident, when we went into Afghanistan and then into Baghdad, we really let the government try and reestablish itself. Took away their military, took away the government, rebuilding it as we speak. So you can kind of see the dilemma then that the Iraqi people are faced with, just in terms of their background and what they're trying to deal with. Now, who's this Saddam Hussein guy? I mentioned he came in around 1958 and really was in power for about 38 years. At birth, you could almost look at his life and compare it to Adolf Hitler, quite honestly, just in terms of influences when he was a kid. His father was very abusive. He didn't know his biological father, but who first raised him. So physically abused him, and his first job was with the Ba'athist Party. And he was the enforcer. So if you think back in the United States during the time of the Mafia, when you had the enforcers who go out and break people's legs and do things that if you didn't do what they wanted, that's what he did for the Ba'athist Party. Well, the Ba'athist Party then, when he came into power during the revolution, when they took charge, he took leadership really by a coup. He used the Ba'athist Party as part of his manipulation. You had to be a member of the Ba'athist Party to have access to education, a job. You had to be a Ba'athist or you were nobody. So he worked his elitism up. The closer you got to him, the more privileges you received. Now you can see the conflict then between that and the Muslim faith even, in terms of how he manipulated the people. Because part of the people, their fear is distrust, which he monopolized because he would pay me to spy on Rollin, Rollin to spy on me, and then whoever he wanted to would knock your door in the middle of the night, drag you or your family off, maybe never to be seen again. So that's the type of harsh ruling that occurs. So everybody's scared to death. And so over time, it's going to take some experience, confidence, and competence for them to be able to reestablish their government. So that's kind of bring us up to the current state of the historical and some of the dilemmas you see. Not much out through here. This is just open desert, and we're going to go on a helicopter flight now a little bit and take off here. I was in up by the airfield and next to Baghdad. And we're going to go down into downtown Baghdad where the multinational forces and multinational corps were located about 6 miles apart. Then we're going to fly up to about right here and see part of this part of the country, and fly back and see some of the life as it exists in Iraq, and then talk about a few more things as we go through here. Next slide, please. This is how we tend to get around. It's a little bit safer than driving on the road. You've heard about the improved explosive devices. Over time, the opponents have gotten more sophisticated in their way of trying to maim or kill us. Now, you heard me talk about the people. There's two extremes on this. There's the Zarqawis of the world, who are descendants of part of Al-Qaeda from Osama bin Laden. But he's really a Jordanian. He's a foreigner. They don't like foreigners, but he's still a foreigner with his training ground in Iraq. So he's worked over time to find out different ways to do these improved explosive devices to disrupt our convoys and mess them up. And so longer trips tended to go by helicopter. When you take off from where we were staying, it gives you some ideas of what the living conditions were like for the majority of the Iraqis. Next slide, please. You can see it's not all dark brown, but majority of the country is what I would call a bit boring. And the next slide. And the soil is really fascinating. It's such fine powder. Any dust storm kicks up, it turns into what would look like fog around here. You can't see. It makes you wonder how animals breathe. I was inside the building talking to someone during one of these major dust storms, and as we were talking, the dust just kind of, as it permeated through the walls, made it to the point that it was foggy just sitting across the table for that individual. You come in and just get the half inch of dirt off your computer and stuff, and it's amazing anything runs, from machinery to computers and how people breathe, and you know some of the houses up there in terms of how this goes. And then when it rains, it won't permeate through the ground, so the water will lie there on the ground for weeks at a time. So some of these houses that are constructed of packed mud, it makes you wonder how the individuals do survive from a health standpoint and just from a comfort standpoint, because electricity is still a problem too with the grid, because that's how Saddam Hussein controlled part of his dictatorship too, was as you were good, you got more electricity. If you weren't, you cut that grid square off. So a lot of them have their own generators and stuff you should fly around, but pretty harsh living. That gives you some idea too of just what some of the other towns look like flying over toward Abu Ghraib in this particular flight. Next slide, please. Some of it is pretty nice. The vegetation you see here are date trees. One of their major outputs is an economic crop. Next slide. Here's one of the aqueducts too. They did a nice job in terms of moving the rivers about. You heard me say that in time about 3% of the potable water and usable water was in Iraq. Now it's down to less than 1% because of pollution. And Saddam Hussein manipulated the entire country by moving the rivers around. Down in the southeast, where I said the Shia were next to Iran, remember he drained all the swamplands so he could maneuver across there and run the people out. A lot of the places you'll see he manipulated the rivers to have nice areas and self-protection around him. So a lot of work done by aqueducts and moving water for agriculture and also just for Saddam Hussein's agenda. Next slide. This is one of the farms I was telling you about, Helen. That's it gets kind of nasty. You heard me tell about the soil, where you can figure a large herd in Iraq is about 10 to 12 Holsteins. And they have this cut out so that they'll just rotate the crops around there. And the sheep are really controlled by shepherds. So even downtown Baghdad, you'll see some sheep out there with a shepherd controlling them. Next slide. Here's another shot of the aqueduct and some of the date trees. Next slide. How they plant them, and a big issue then each fall is how they spray for insects and how they harvest it and make sure they don't go to waste, because there's not much time before they ripen until they fall off the tree that are of no value. Next slide. Then you can see how then you get out of the nice green area into what many of us think of Iraq. Next slide. And the variations in the terrain. This looks at the Tigris River heading to the northeast up toward men we're going to see up in Kurd, part of the Kurds. Next slide. Part of the even agriculture areas that are pretty dry, you can see how they're worked out, done with some areas to move water in when they can bring it in from the rivers. Next slide. And some of the rougher terrains in various parts of the country. So it's not like it's easy to to move from point A to point B, but also you can see the roads that are cut through there, the significance from an economic standpoint and a transnational standpoint of moving goods. Next slide. This is another one of the villages. You can see the type of architecture they have, mud, and how they pack it and live quite close together in this part of the world. You wonder how it holds up, but I guess with the small amount of rain, they tend to do, say they've been there for centuries, so it tends to work. Next slide. This is one of the, you heard me talk about the Peshmerga, which is the military along the Green Line up in the lands where the Kurd lives. This is where it's one of their camps up there, and they also have built these along the Iranian border and along the Syrian border, where a lot of the terrorists come back and forth in terms of the world. Next slide. This is the leaders we're going to meet, one of the Kurds up in his part of the northeast. Next slide. So you can see what his office is like. This is Major General John DeFreitas, who was the senior intelligence officer when I was there, who I worked for him, for General Casey. And he worked with Special Forces. We're up there doing some negotiations and work with one of the leaders from that part of the region. Next slide. And flying back, you can see some of the other agriculture areas. We move into the closer into Baghdad in that part. Next slide. Next slide. Now we're in one of the major cities in Outropolis. This was Samarra, just to the northeast of Baghdad. Next slide. Once again, you can see now after one of the rains how the water tends to lie out there in the areas next to these homes and the living conditions. And it doesn't show you some of the major cities after the conflict that are being restored right now. Next slide. This is on the outskirts of Baghdad, and you can see the living conditions there. Next slide. And as we're flying over to some of the towns as they're running their auto stores and repair work, that sort of thing. Next slide. This is one of the older towns just to the northeast of Baghdad. You see some of the old walls that were built. And Baghdad, even as the roads were designed, was designed to protect from invasion from both the Iranian side and the other side. Remember, from 1980 to 1988, Saddam Hussein fought the Iran-Iraq war, and you have a hard time discerning who won. All we know is a lot of people were killed, and the end result was just, we'll stop now. And but the influence of part of the fears we see now from the Iranian influence in Iraq is there's still a lot of distrust. We worry about the Iranian influence, but it's not as strong as we tend to think it is because of the conflict and the number of people that were killed. However, there's still a large number of the Iranians come over through Iraq, going to Saudi Arabia to Medina for their journey back as part of their faith. Next slide. This gives you now closer to Baghdad. You can see how the area is built up there. Next slide. And now getting into town, one could argue it looks like some of our own cities in terms of how it's built, but there's walls around. And part of what's changed Iraq forever, I think, see this? In about every building you go, you see these satellite dishes. And so I do believe that part of what we're dealing with now is, I like to describe it as scraping the scales off of their eyes and letting them see the rest of the world. And what they were told over time wasn't really true. And once people are informed, it's much more difficult to suppress them. Next slide. Now we're going into a part of Baghdad that still looks like pretty much of a major city until you get down in some of the areas where their conditions of sanitary is not quite like ours. I guess they have burning days or whatever, but a lot of bottled water. And the way to get rid of the bottles, empty bottles, is take them out in the street and burn them. So a lot of these towns you just see on certain nights that it's a bit odoriferous, and the piles of trashes, they just burn them out in the streets, which is not just Iraq. Other cultures do that too in ways of getting rid of their waste. Next slide. You'll see mosques everywhere. And as I mentioned, inside the mosque, we could not go when we're infidels. And the view of an infidel is that's a conflict and really an opponent, if you will, of the Muslim faith, because our religion doesn't align with theirs, and so you would not be welcome. In fact, it would be very dangerous to go inside one of the mosques. So that's part of the issues when we think in terms of the conflict there, because they'll use the mosque to their advantage, so they know we can't attack them or deface them at all. Next slide, please. Now there's some more of the mosques in the area. Next slide. Next slide. Now we're flying back into Camp Victory. This is one of Saddam Hussein's 72 castles. or palaces in town, in the country. This is one of the smaller ones. Next slide. Next slide. That's a bridge on the east side of it that was destroyed by some of the bombing. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. It's hard to, pictures do not do it justice, but inside, even on the ceilings, it's all inlaid, painted decorations with Saddam Hussein's initials. There's always subliminal messages about the goodness of Saddam Hussein and how he used all that. Now, water around those palaces looks nice, but when you really look at how it's all laid out, part of it's for self-defense. What we did not realize is how afraid he was of everybody around him because he knew his own people he couldn't trust. Part of it was his own doing. His son-in-law's family did something he didn't like, so he killed them all in front of his son-in-law. And that type of fear and manipulation going on amongst the people. Next slide. That's just the chandeliers. You walked into Multinational Forces headquarters, where I worked in the morning and then went back to another place in the afternoon. But you couldn't help but marvel as you walked through all. It's all marble too. Next slide. But the construction is a facade. When you look at the marble, it's pretty thin. You look at the construction of the building. There's like chicken wire in the middle of the outside of the concrete forms. So far it's standing up, and the question is how long it will be over time, how it's there. Next slide. Some of the other, once again, this is one of the 72 palaces. This is for Allenbaugh Palace to memorize the victory of Iraq in the Iraqi war, and the big fighting was down in the Allenbaugh province. That's what. It lit up. We didn't do this every night, but there was one celebration that they lit it all up just to get an idea of how nice it looked. You wouldn't want to invite the mortar rounds to come in with all the lights on. Next slide. What's fascinating now, right across the street from that, where the Multinational Forces headquarters are, if you read that, it says the headquarters of the Ground Forces Command. That's Iraqi. Next slide. So where we've progressed in time now is beginning to embed the U.S. military in with their Iraqi security forces, which now number in excess of 181,000, to help train them. And their headquarters is right across the street now from the Multinational Forces, which kind of is a tremendous message when you think about the progress being made, even with all the challenges we face. Next slide. This is where I worked then in the afternoon. Not a bad setting, I have to admit. Next slide. It's called the Perfume Palace. And I'm sure there's stories that could be told about this. Next slide. This is for Saddam Hussein's son, Uday, who I guess was a bit on the, he liked to party a lot. So this is all part of the convention area for the Ba'athist Party, who were the elite, and they would come into this as for their entertainment at night. Next slide. This is the Victory Palace. Half of this was going to be devoted to the United States, the victory over us, and the other part, the victory over Iran. Next slide. It never got finished, as you can see, but it's hard to, once again, show the massive size of these buildings. Next slide. I never got it finished and some of the destruction inside, but you can begin to see this is just one wing of it. Next slide. Next slide. Across the way was a zoo they had put there for the kids of the members of the Ba'athist Party when they came, so they could come and be entertained by the animals. You can see the water all around. Next slide. That's the setting over at Camp Slayer, right by the airport, where once again the conventions occurred. And this was the Ba'athist Party Convention Center. There was 2 rounds went in here when they did the attack on Iraq. In fact, Sergeant Smith, who had the First Medal of Honor for many years in the Army, the battle that occurs right outside all the walls going over there to Camp Slayer, that he was honored with that last November. Next slide. This is a view out of the top of that window just to give you all that water that's been dug out, piled up, and moved in from the Euphrates River. And you can see how the area's been manipulated by him. Next slide. This shows how we're back at Camp Victory now, how the U.S. soldiers, a lot of the rivals, where they stay when they first get there. Next slide. There's another shot of that. Next slide. This is one of our divisions. It gives you an idea of it's hard to imagine the amount of supplies, people, all the movement that occurs as the people rotate in and out to the organization. Next slide. That shows it during one of the minor dust storms. It gives you an idea of what it looks like. Next slide. These are the vehicles that we would go in convoys that were all reinforced, once again, for prevention of the IEDs. There's maneuvers that were used. And next slide. It wasn't all bad. I came back one day from one of these trips. So these are people from Washington, D.C., and Charlie Daniels was performing that night. And he said he was from North Carolina, down in Bladen County. But not too often you walk out and there's Charlie Daniels. So got the chance to see him. Next slide. That's the victory over Iraq symbols downtown that we see that, once again, Iraq just tries to memorize. Saddam Hussein made a big deal about how well things were going during his regime. Next slide. And this is the last of the slides, but the significance of this is in Abu Ghraib, the prison that where, go backing in the historical records, we know that Saddam Hussein killed or had executed there at least 20,000. And some of the brutality that went on there. And these members of the Iraqi security force, this is just a small part of them. I was their guest speaker for the graduation ceremony. And he's a Kurd that works in their special forces, lives in the outskirts of Baghdad. He was a Shia married to a Sunni in the Iraqi security forces. And over here was another Sunni. So their culture, the way you get confessions is you just beat somebody until they confess. And then once they confess, you're good to go. You're going to jail. So it's difficult for them to change their cultural understanding, just how things work. So it was fascinating for them to understand that you could, in fact, interrogate individuals without abuse and part of the cultural changes. Now, when we think about this, what we're trying to accomplish there, if you think about the world I described to you and how they're raised in time, it's the reverse of a democracy. They're raised, and their culture says they appreciate power and the supreme position, whoever that is. And they strive to get there. And they know these positions have privileges. That's part of when you think in terms of how cultures are. There's an abstract culture. That's pretty much what we are. We believe that your education, your background, your experiences, you kind of work toward what you aspire to be. On this type of culture is associative. Your family that you're born into, all this gives you the privileges, if you will, of where you fit in society. So democracy takes that whole model and turns it upside down. Because as you know, we believe power is at the people's base, and at the top of the government, they're supposed to take care of the people. So we're asking a fundamental change in thinking and how they apply this. But we also see the majority of the Iraqis do not want us to leave yet because they know they're not quite ready. But they also know they don't want us to stay. So it's kind of like Korea. You know, they'll manipulate us a little bit depending on what the situation is on how they see us. But they also are very enthused by their contribution to their participatory government. And Jeffersonian democracy, I don't believe, is what we're seeking here. We have a hard time ourselves describing what Jeffersonian model democracy is. But if you think in terms of them being able to participate in their future, have a secure environment, take care of the families, and most importantly, not be afraid of that fearful knock in the middle of the night when you or your family members drug out never to be seen again, or to be abused for how long, for whatever the case may be. So these elections they had, the second one now, the one before, remember, is to elect the provisional government. Now this full-fledged election is very important. Now you see the upturn in the violence. Once again, the Sunnis trying to, once again, do everything they can to disrupt what the future may be. But also don't think of it as being simply a cultural, religious thing, because you saw that dilemma already. But now there's just a plain outside terrorist activity going on that they're using Iraq as a training base. So part of the Zarqawis of the world, you read about him in the paper, the leader of the Al-Qaeda group. There is no answer. We really just have to kill them because they don't like us. They don't like what we stand for. They're never going to appreciate anything about us, and we're a threat to their way of thinking. But it's not necessarily in accordance with the Quran because they manipulate this for their own power base. You've got that going on. the other extreme, you've got the former regime who just don't get it yet, don't realize that they have to make a living somehow, so they'll get paid to fire an IED off, which is $100, which is 2 months' pay, until they get a job base back. And then you've got a criminal element cut across this. So much time, it's like downtown Chicago in 1820. People control city blocks, and they basically get paid for that control. So you've got that going on too. This is not an easy situation, but I do believe as we invest in the future, trying to build a democratic process here where people begin to participate, that we have a chance for a part of the world that's better for mankind in our future. This is a slide, this is a video, about a 3-minute one that was made in Iraq right after the first elections that shows about the actual process that went through there that I think is kind of informative. As I bring this to close, the last clip I think is well done, I believe, in terms of an honor to the men and women that have served, are still serving, and many going back for the second and third rotations in Iraq. You've heard in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, the progress we're making, and the challenges we're faced with, but it's all about people and the sacrifices of families and resources of not only our country but the coalition partners is here to make the world as we know it to better. So I thank you for the honor, the privilege, and the honor to talk to you, and to Jane and everybody else getting the word out. And I leave you with this thought.
Back home now, I know you're probably sleeping. Over here it's the middle of the day. I finally found some time to write a letter. Sitting here, a half a world away. I've heard about all them folks protesting, as if I really want this war. But that don't stop me from believing there's just some things worth fighting for. And if I die before you wake, I pray the world would take a good look at what God's given us. That we could only understand everything is in His hands. All we need is a little faith and trust. I want you to know it ain't too high a price to pay if I die before you wake. Tell everybody that I miss them, and I can't wait to get back home. But until then, I'll serve my country and be proud to wear this uniform. And if I die before you wake, I pray the world would take a good look at what God's given us. That we could only understand everything is in His hands. All we need is a little faith and trust. I want you to know it ain't too high a price to pay if I die before you wake. No, it ain't too high a price to pay if I die before you wake.
We often think of our soldiers in other lands, and we think about their bravery and courage and their sacrifices. I know when I think of Rick, I often think of not just those things, those are important as well, but intelligence and integrity. And I'm really pleased that God has raised up someone like Rick to impact the world in an area that most of us will never have any influence. But he is used of God in some incredible ways, and there are just hundreds of stories that can illustrate that. And all of us are here because we know and appreciate Rick and his family and know of the work that he's doing, and we want to be an encouragement of that, and we wanted to learn. I want to thank you for coming today. That's really a tremendous tribute to what God is doing through Rick and around the world. We're delighted to be able to host this, and I know that you would much rather right now be interacting and visiting with Rick than hearing me ramble. So what we're going to do at this time is I'm just going to have a word of prayer, and then we will be dismissed. So let's pray. God, it is a great thing that your world is. Your love and your mercy and your grace is worthy of any sacrifice that we can make on our parts to declare and to bring honor to. And the way of life that you have allowed us to have is a precious and special thing, and yet we need to recognize you above anything else. And Lord, I know that you are in control, even of these faraway places that seem so strange and so different to us. But there are people there that you love, and there are people that Jesus died for. And so we are grateful, Lord, for those of such high integrity that are willing to make such great sacrifices to go and to try to bring peace and understanding into this world. God, I thank you for this opportunity today to just share and to hear just a little bit of what you are doing in our world. And it helps us to understand that it is so important for us to continue to pray for your sovereignty throughout the world, and to support and to be patient, because we know you do great and wonderful things, but you do them in your time. And so today, Lord, we just want in our hearts to commit to doing this further, to pray more, to follow your lead in many ways. We thank you for the opportunity you've given to us. Thank you for the lives you have given to us. And again, we need to hear your voice and respond to you, to give you praise. Thank you for this time together. We just welcome you and honor you through it. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.